All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. I don't want to take up too much time here. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to the State of Monarch Conservation. Today's webinar is presented by Monarch Joint Ventures Executive Director Wendy Caldwell and is hosted by Court Whalen. My name is Alyssa Taylor. I am a program coordinator with the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm going to be on the back end, behind the scenes, tech problems. So if you need anything, I'm available in the chat, but hopefully we won't have any issues with that. Before I get started and turn it over to Court, I do want to just give you a few small reminders about Zoom and a few community guidelines. So during the webinar today, you'll notice that you'll want to put your questions at the bottom. There is a Q&A box. That's what we will be utilizing today to collect questions for our speakers later. So please use that Q&A box at the bottom. And not the chat to be asking our questions. The other thing you can do is upvote. So you'll see a little thumb. So if there's a question that you are also interested in that somebody already asked, click that and upvote it so that we know it's something that is of interest to multiple people. We will be recording this webinar today, so keep that in mind as well. You can come back, you can rewatch. If you have to leave early, no problem. So this will be uploaded on our website likely by the end of this week or beginning of next week. So you could check that out as well as our webinar archive from our 10 years of monarch conservation webinars. So feel free to look at those. If you are joining us today but didn't pre-register for the webinar for some reason, after I'm done here, I will add into the chat an email in which you can reach out to make sure that we can get to you for your webinar and our follow-up emails. So back-end tech problems, I'm here for you. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Court to get started.
Great. Well, thank you, Alyssa. All those things are super important today, so we appreciate that. And greetings, everyone. My name's Court Whalen. I will be the host of tonight's presentation, which is going to kick us off here. I'm going to do an intro about Wendy here in just a second, and I'm also going to be facilitating the Q&A section later. But just a quick note about myself. I'm a Monarch Joint Venture board member. I'm also a longtime Monarch Conservation biologist starting in grad school days some 20, 25 years ago. And I'm currently, well, in addition to being a current monarch conservation ambassador, I also guide trips down to see the monarch migration, which is where some of you may know me from. So without further ado, I wanted to just say how delighted I am to be here, how delighted I am to have you all in the audience. And I was thinking earlier today, how darn cool it is to have hundreds and hundreds of people. We have record number of registrations for this, taking time out of their day in the middle of the week, in the evening, to learn about and to educate yourself on the current state of monarch conservation. And while there are so many things that are going to be discussed that you will learn about today and tools that you can take away from this and follow-up emails, just simply by being here is an amazing step in the right direction to educate yourself, inform yourself, and hopefully inspire yourself. So without further ado, I'm going to read Wendy's bio here. I haven't memorized it yet, so I am going to have to read it. Apologies for looking down at various moments here. But yeah, big welcome to Wendy. Big thank you to Wendy for all you do for Monarch Joint Venture and for Monarchs. And of course, in advance, thank you for this presentation today. So we're delighted to have you here as well, Wendy. So Wendy, from helping draft the North American Monarch Conservation Plan to coordinating community science, teaching teachers, and supporting monarch research, Wendy has built an extensive background in conservation over the last nearly 20 years at this point. Growing the partnership to over 100 organizations today, Wendy has led the MJV through many transitions as the partnership diversified, staff grew, and the organization transitioned from a university-based program to one that is now a standalone nonprofit. Now here's the personal stuff. Growing up on a farm in West Central Minnesota, Wendy understands the value of hard work and perseverance. While pursuing degrees in environmental science and entomology at the University of Minnesota, she worked as a program coordinator for several initiatives at the university's Monarch Lab. While she has worked directly on monarch conservation in some capacity since 2007, Wendy also has broader conservation and research experience through positions held with the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and the Illinois Natural History Survey. She enjoys spending time outdoors with her family, doing just about anything: sports, hiking, kayaking, gardening, invasive species removal. That's probably my favorite one there. Bird watching and more. So once again, a warm welcome to Wendy here, and please go ahead and take it away. We'll see you later for the Q&A.
Thanks, Court, and thanks, Alyssa, and thanks to the behind the scenes folks who are also a part of making this webinar happen. I'm going to pull up my slides here as we get started. And yes, invasive species removal is a fun pastime. When I'm not working in monarch conservation, I'm working in monarch conservation in some capacity, generally it seems. I'm excited to be here with you tonight. Thank you for taking time out of your evening, or if you're watching this after the fact, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to listen in on the state of monarch conservation. I thought we'd first check in on where are the monarchs now. So we go to our trusty source of monarch migration information through a program called Journey North, which now the Monarch Joint Venture has taken under its wing as a program of our organization. You can see here, this map represents monarch migration in real time. So we can see these monarchs as they're moving south through points that people are reporting from across the country, from across North America. So you can see monarchs are in Texas, and to some extent delayed by some warm temperatures and south winds that are keeping them from continuing their journey as quickly as we maybe would expect, but they are on their way. I also wanted to share a cool new project that we had the opportunity to be involved with, to get more involved with this year, Project Monarch. This is the program where they're using radio transmitter, small, tiny little tags that we were fortunate to get some of and apply to monarchs from where our staff are located across the country, along with many other of our conservation collaborators, to really track monarchs in much more real time. So we can see from the map, from the Journey North map, where we were, seeing monarchs and reporting those monarchs. These radio transmitters are going to give us incredible new insights into how fast and how far and what direction monarchs are traveling. So a lot of really cool information is going to come from this study this year. So we look forward to that publication. But you can see these are our butterflies. If you want to track them, if you want to see where they're headed, what they're named, several are named after MJV staff. Download the Project Monarch app. This work is led by Cape May Science Center and Cellular Tracking Technologies. And so all of these butterflies have been tagged and are being actively reported through this app interface. You can see on the right-hand side an example of, you can also isolate individual butterflies to see where their detections have been, where they started, and where they are currently, which is pretty incredible. Where have we been this breeding season? I like to, this is one of those things that's difficult to really put the whole picture together until we have that overwintering population data from California or from Mexico. And so, we can look at this in a lot of different ways. And so what I've done here is pulled a comparison of Monarch Larva Monitoring Project data for Minnesota from 2024 and 2025. The numbers, the red circled numbers here, are the number I want you to pay attention to. So this chart is representing, different stages of monarchs that volunteers are reporting week to week at different sites throughout, in this case, Minnesota. So the number reflected is monarchs per milkweed plant. And so we look at this density of monarchs on milkweed plants observed to see, and then we can see how this changes from year to year to give us some relative indication of, is it generally a good year for monarchs during the breeding season, or maybe not so much in that particular region. So a couple of things you can see here from 2024 in Minnesota, we had quite a few eggs right away when monarchs were getting to Minnesota, but then survival was pretty low and numbers fell off. So you can see these, look at these peaks as generations of monarchs. So this is monarchs arriving in the spring, and then the second peak being, when those eggs that were laid in the spring have become adults and are starting to lay the next generation of offspring. So in 2024, that second peak is representing 0.15 monarchs per milkweed plant. Whereas in 2025, this current season that we're coming out of, we were closer to 0.25. So we're seeing an increase in the density of immature monarchs that we were seeing out, at least in Minnesota. Here's, to look at a different region, here's what it looked like for New York. And this is about 20 to 30 sites monitored annually in these locations. I can't quite explain what's happening with the 2024 data. That's a little not what we would expect in terms of peaks, but in general, you can see that still, these numbers of, approaching 0.35 monarchs per milkweed is a pretty indicative of a good breeding season. And why is this important? So I showed Minnesota and I showed New York to really indicate this regional importance. And so we get a lot of questions about where should we prioritize our efforts in monarch conservation. And as you'll continue to hear throughout this presentation, it's a really complicated topic. And so this work by Flockhart et al. In 2017 used isotopes to determine where monarchs that were reaching, eastern monarchs that were reaching the overwintering sites in Mexico, where were they coming from? And so you can see this breakdown here that, like, while yes, there was a large proportion, the largest proportion of monarchs reaching Mexico come from this Midwest Corn Belt region, the other regions are still on the map and they're not insignificant. And so when we think about monarch conservation prioritization, we can't necessarily put all of our eggs in one basket. We have to make sure that efforts to conserve monarchs are distributed throughout these regions that are all contributing to that overwintering population success. Because factors like weather and climate, so when you pair that information with things like, wind and weather and drought, we can start to see why different regions of the country might actually be more important during a year when, say, if the Midwest has extreme drought conditions, the Northeast and other regions of the country might be contributing more heavily to that overwintering population success. And so really we have to look at all of these different variables and all of these different factors to most effectively conserve the monarch population. So that's kind of this year. Now I want to dig into a little bit of the status and trends for monarchs historically. Starting with a couple of graphs I hope you've all seen before. This is information. Why we're all here is because monarch populations have been in decline. And while that may not be a stepwise decline every year, there have been ups and downs in the population. These populations for both eastern monarchs overwintering in central Mexico and western monarchs overwintering along the California coast, well below the population size where we can feel confident that they can continue to persist through extreme weather events or other circumstances given their broad geographic range. I also wanted to emphasize, that monarch conservation has really its history has been a voluntary conservation model. So voluntary conservation and collaboration. We've really achieved what we have thus far through voluntary actions versus regulatory mandates. We've accomplished that through leveraging this icon, the charismatic monarch butterfly, to achieve not just monarch conservations, but multiple benefits beyond, that benefiting the species that share the same habitat that monarchs do. It's also been a powerful tool in bringing collaborators together, not just across the country, not just across the United States, but actually across the continent, bringing Canada and Mexico collaborators into a joint effort, a collaborative strategy to protect this iconic species and its habitat. Monarch Joint Venture has been a big part of that collaboration and coordination since 2008, where we're bringing together now quickly approaching 150 organizations from across the US, from local volunteer groups to state and federal natural resource agencies, businesses, nonprofits, academic institutions. So really this broad ranging partnership and collaboration, working to help the US advance its part in the North American monarch conservation strategy. In Canada and Mexico, I'm going to dig deeper into the US provisions in the Endangered Species Act, but also quickly highlight that, in 2023, monarchs were listed as endangered under the Canada Species at Risk Act, SARA. And so they've been afforded endangered species protections in Canada and in Mexico. Back to the 1980s, there were various decrees protecting the monarch butterfly biosphere reserve, the area in Mexico where the butterflies are overwintering. So they're also seeing those federal protections in Mexico. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 2022 to 2023 also listed migratory monarchs as vulnerable on their species red list. So our US Endangered Species Act listing process, it's been quite the journey, starting back in 2014. So in 2014, the US Fish and Wildlife Service received a petition to consider whether or not monarch butterflies should be afforded protections under our Endangered Species Act. After some consideration, they determined it warranted further investigation. And that kind of kicked off along. There's a lot that happened in between that I'm leaving out of this presentation, but for that 6 years, 2014 to 2020, the US Fish and Wildlife Service was engaging science experts and collaborators in assessing the status of the species globally, and not just assessing the status of the species, but also what level of conservation efforts for monarchs were actually actively happening or were planned, and use that to determine whether or not their listing was warranted under the Endangered Species Act. That brings us to December of 2020, where a decision was made that monarchs were warranted for listing, but they were precluded by other higher priority actions. That being said, there were several other species on their work plan that needed to come first before we could get to the monarch proposed ruling. So kind of fast forward to modern day, and just last year, a year ago, December 2024, there was a proposal to list monarchs as threatened under the Endangered Species Act with a 4D rule, which I'll talk about in my next slide. And so that's just a proposal. And so beyond that, once the proposals happened, it goes out for public comment. Monarchs had I think an initial 90-day public comment period that was actually then extended because I think monarchs set a record number of public comments that the Fish and Wildlife Service received regarding their proposed ruling. In a typical process, then they would have about a year from their proposed rule to issue a final rule. And it's at that stage that monarchs would then be afforded the actual protections and provisions of the Endangered Species Act. So realistically, we would be expecting that final rule to come this coming December 2025. However, given some of the disruptions and uncertainty in our government this year, I personally would be surprised if we actually see that finalized rule come to be exactly a year following the proposed rule. So what does that proposed rule outline? It's a lot of Endangered Species Act language, but what you kind of need to know here is that it was listed as threatened versus endangered. So endangered is the most severe of listings, whereas threatened is a step down, with a 4D rule and a critical habitat rule. So critical habitat being this area that's been identified, these specific geographic areas that are absolutely required for the species to be sustained. So while milkweed habitat everywhere across the country would be hard to designate as critical habitat, we didn't see that as the critical habitat listing, but we did see 62 overwintering sites and their support zones that surround them in California under this critical habitat rule. So there's just more intensive protections for these specific geographic areas. The 4D rule is a broad public provision basically designed to take into consideration the flexibilities that might be needed to continue to manage habitat for monarchs, to continue land uses that are already not necessarily providing significant monarch benefit. So, providing protections with flexibility to make sure that we're really engaging widespread in participation in these conservation efforts. So for example, the 4D rule says things like, you're not going to be pursued if you hit a monarch with your vehicle. Some of these things that can't necessarily be prevented. Certain landscapes like row crop agriculture or backyards, manicured lawns aren't necessarily considered actively habitat for monarchs. So there are exemptions in those cases. But also it outlines things like, we know that monarch habitat, grassland habitat, needs to be actively managed to continue to protect the integrity of that habitat, to continue to support monarchs. And so it affords some flexibility to manage those landscapes, even though there might be some monarch take in those instances. And then an endangered species listing also unfolds all kinds of federal consultations. So the Fish and Wildlife Service then has to consult with various different agencies about how they're taking action to protect monarchs, and they each have their own consultation about what they're doing and what they're doing on federal lands, what they're doing with federal support dollars. So there's a lot of complicated jargon there in terms of federal consultations. But one program that I wanted to highlight that's been a huge success is this Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, a long title for a program on energy and transportation lands. This is led by the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group at University of Illinois, Chicago. And I just read their newsletter and thought it was incredibly impressive. They've now reached this milestone of over 1.2 million acres of energy and transportation lands enrolled in this program across 47 states. So really strong engagement from that energy and transportation sector to take these proactive measures to improve monarch and pollinator habitat on their lands. All that to say, should monarchs be afforded a final proposal for Endangered Species Act listing, I still feel like we're relying on a future, not just a history of voluntary conservation, but a future of voluntary conservation. We need everyone to play a role in this. And while species protections through something like the Endangered Species Act may help to bring additional attention and resources to monarch conservation, one thing that's kind of interesting and not well known is that then monarchs just are added to a list with hundreds of other species on that state wildlife agencies have to manage. It doesn't necessarily mean that they get more money to protect monarchs. It just means monarchs are on the list of all the other species that they have the same pot of funding to support. So it's not beneficial. It just doesn't unleash a whole new set of resources for broader conservation. So we approach this from, we call these our 4 pillars, but it pertains to monarch conservation more broadly. So we're attacking this from all angles through habitat conservation, obviously being our primary goal and outcome, through education, through science, and through partnership. And so to go through some of these, I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that I see in each of these areas. Starting with habitat conservation. There are a lot of challenges, but also we have incredible opportunities. So there's never going to be enough funding to support the number of habitat projects, the diversity of habitat projects we want to restore on the landscape. So there's just limited resources in general. One of the areas of low-hanging fruit that's currently a challenge is that when we're pursuing funding for habitat projects, oftentimes these long-term management actions are not necessarily a priority for a funder. We're looking for new acres and more acres of habitat restored on the landscape, which sounds great from a funding perspective, but it's often at the compromise or sacrifice of quality of some of these habitats that are already in place that simply need to be managed better to maintain the right kinds of plants in those landscapes. We encounter a lot of, there's a lot of different programs available, but sometimes when we're working with different landowners, programs can be restrictive or complex, or funding requirements might force us to work in a really specific geography where we might not have interested and willing and ready landowners to start a habitat project. So just some complexity in those opportunities as well. And this, habitat restoration, prairie restoration is really not, it's conceptually seems easy, but the more you know, the more you don't know. So it can be a fairly complicated process to get people started on and know what they're doing. So it's a lot of work by our expert staff and our partners to really be available to help landowners of all shapes and sizes install the project that's right for them. We run into accessibility, cost, availability of the appropriate plant materials. Of course, changing climate and invasive species are invading and degrading our habitat efforts as well. So what are our opportunities? We really embrace this philosophy at Monarch Joint Venture. We need all hands on deck. We need habitat everywhere. So that's backyard gardens, that's on your porch, that's on our roadsides, it's in our agricultural margins, it's in our public lands, it's everywhere. We also need to manage our lands intentionally and make sure when we put that habitat in, we're also taking follow-up actions long-term to protect it and manage it for multiple benefits. So while we are the Monarch Joint Venture, while monarch conservation is important, certainly it's not the only piece of the puzzle factor in the equation that we're working to accomplish here. So every project we design to have multiple benefits beyond monarchs. We also need to be thinking about the future. It can be appealing to try to restore things to historical context, but the climate is changing, and we have to think about how to make sure these habitats are resilient into the future. And a lot of that kind of boils down to this last point of not letting perfection be the enemy of good. We have limited resources. We have limited landscapes that we're allowed to work within when we get the right landowner interest and permission. And so sometimes we have to design the right project for that person instead of and connect them with the right program. And it might not be the highest quality habitat that we would like to see, but yet it's better than nothing, right? To feature a couple of efforts that our habitat team at Monarch Joint Venture have done this year, we acquired about 2 years ago a 20-acre campus in Minnesota. And so this year has been the year of really kind of mobilizing some habitat projects at our demonstration site here in Minnesota. So we've worked with our county program to put in a rain garden. We used a volunteer group to install a butterfly garden. We recently got a grant to help renovate our greenhouse. We have this high tunnel structure that's there, and we're going to revisit or renovate that so that we can start to grow some of our own plants. We've worked with companies to do milkweed giveaways for their employees from an employee engagement standpoint, or just to give away to the broader public. And last but not least, we piloted a cover crop program, a blooming cover crop program. So where we're not just looking at these opportunities for perennial plantings like perennial gardens, but also more temporary or seasonal things through something like a flowering cover crop. Moving on to science, our biggest challenges here are data. So there's never enough data. And, a lot of times it's hard to share that information because it might be protected or they're all in different databases. And so it's an interesting and really difficult challenge to try to bring data sets together, especially when we have inconsistent methods. So if a lot of people are collecting information in slightly different ways, it sounds good, but it's really actually very challenging to try to pull all that data together for some of these broader analyses that we can look at for this monarch population. And on the data and program support, we feel this strongly right now. Aging infrastructure is, technology and online, things are rapidly evolving, and that means that things that were built 25 years ago are actively breaking. And so we see some challenges with that side of science work as well. Similarly, you know, where we never have enough funding for all the habitat projects, habitat gets most of the funding priority, whereas science and education and some of these other aspects that are integral to conservation efforts are often secondary, if not at all a funding priority when we're going to seek funding for this work. One of the challenges we continue to see with advancing the science is you get a lot of, there's not enough information, so a lot of times results are inconclusive, and that may result in conflicting guidance as to what should we do. And so if we were trying to wait for the science to be crystal clear, we see that as the potential for really stalling action, proactive conservation action. And then, as I mentioned, things change rapidly, so we're also seeing challenges with things being outdated that might not really actually reflect current conditions. And so needing to know what to do with that information that might be our best available science, but also recognizing that it's outdated and could use an update. So in terms of opportunities that we have with science and what we're embracing moving forward, you know, really, we run a program, the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, really focusing on this as a standardized protocol, focused on measuring the vegetation quality of habitat. So we really see this foundational vegetation tracking tool as an important starting point in bringing data together, focusing on vegetation, but then on top of that, we can stack monarch surveys or pollinator surveys or bird surveys. You know, you can stack all these other biodiversity measurements on top of a standardized vegetation protocol. So that's a lot of where our science efforts are headed, is focusing on tracking vegetation quality. And that also helps us to inform better management actions. We've talked a lot about how can we better measure biodiversity, not with necessarily super intense protocols, but as a society, we have to start to better value biodiversity benefits in order to help the broader public understand the true economic value of the work that we do to preserve biodiversity. We've been really investing a lot in innovating with technology through remote sensing, which I'll share a little bit more about on my next slide. Targeting our research questions to have the biggest conservation gains. So there are a lot of really interesting questions we could answer about monarchs and monarch biology and conservation. But really, if we have limited resources, our efforts are to target those questions that are really going to have the biggest conservation impacts. We also recognize that we have an opportunity to be better about how we communicate science, share the current research, and make sure that it has a practical conservation application. So not just what does the science show, but how does this affect change in how we're approaching conservation actions. So as mentioned, this remote sensing work has been a really important and growing tool. We work with Polly, our business collaborator, who's helped us to design machine learning, computer vision models for common milkweed and for broader vegetation quality. So we have two different, you know, essentially the long and short of how this works. The drone, we can now fly drones over habitat. It takes pictures of that habitat, and then we can process those through these machine learning algorithms. And you know, the computer will draw boxes around the milkweed and count them for you. It will give you a map of how much of this habitat is blooming plants versus grasses versus water versus bare soil. So it gives us pretty incredible information about those habitats. Community engagement and education. You know, I think we can all feel this. Today's society is distracted and disconnected from nature. We're moving from thing to thing, and it's just, you know, often hard to spend that time in nature, not just learning about it, but appreciating it and enjoying it. And through COVID, we learned to appreciate and adapt. And how do we, but now, kind of a modern day challenge of how do we balance virtual engagement with the power of in-person connection? As mentioned with all the other programs, funding is limited or very localized. And so we struggle with how to fund this education work. And then we have simple information, but there are a lot of complexities to this. And so how do we make sure that we're reaching people with not just accurate, but sometimes often very nuanced information? So our opportunities in this community engagement and education space, we are focused really a lot on this year on how can we bring local partners together, local collaborators together to build longer term commitments and impact at a community scale. How can we broaden our reach and bring new people to the table, finding that common ground where we know we're not going to achieve monarch conservation goals if we don't continue to bring new perspectives, new audiences to the table. So we have to do this slightly different than we have historically. And in order to do that, we also are focusing on how do we offer many different ways for involvement at every level, from planting milkweeds in your backyard to, just going out in your community and being able to talk about the importance of monarch conservation. And again, with sharing these stories, celebrating our successes and lessons learned in a way that's inspiring to the broader public to get more of those folks involved. Here's a smattering of different education initiatives where there's a lot of different things going on here. You can see the group of kids. We had Fridays at the farm at our Monarch Joint Venture campus, where the local school was bringing their kids out to learn about insects and habitat conservation and enjoy our farm campus every few weeks during the summer. Our online Nectar Hub has been growing incredibly with new courses and reaching people across the country with online learning opportunities. I believe the symbolic monarch migration butterflies, the paper butterflies, are en route, if not soon to be en route to their destination in Mexico. That's an effort of monarchs across Georgia that Monarch Joint Venture has been participating more in this year. I threw the Monarch Way Station map on here. I think they've reached an incredible milestone with these certified habitats and signs in people's backyards. They've reached over 50,000 way stations at this point. And then, of course, our staff and partners are out in communities offering outreach materials and conversation with people for what they can do and how to engage more closely with us. And kind of last pillar here, partnerships. Our challenges here, we're bringing all hands on deck. We're bringing, this broad tent approach, but with those diverse perspectives, it can lead to differing priorities. And then, where we're seeking consensus, it can be challenging to navigate these diverse perspectives where, people might be approaching this very differently. We also find a lot that people don't have time. They've got a lot on their plates, and to really look into, fully engage with partnerships and learn from others, it feels like a lot of time to dedicate to building those relationships and learning about what's out there versus just feeling like you have to start from scratch. So that's one of the challenges. And then kind of finally, I feel like to some extent this can result in a little bit of duplication of effort, but where alignment across all these different sectors, it's like federal agencies have a way of doing things. State agencies have a way of doing things. Minnesota has a way of doing things. And so energy and transportation, everybody has their own way of doing things. And so often we see plans that might be, not necessarily redundant. They're tailored to that particular sector or region, but it makes it harder to bring the whole strategy together, if that makes sense. So our opportunities here, really, we embrace the broad tent, welcoming of diverse partners and perspectives to expand our reach and to mobilize our mission in new ways. Finding those shared goals and strengths of the partnership to bring meaningful and sustainable conservation actions. Really knowing that while it feels like a lot of time, collaborating across sectors to really get everyone involved is going to continue to be super important at tackling this from multiple angles. And then just the more the merrier. I think the more our network grows, the more participation we get in conservation action. Here is our 2025 North American Summit. We hosted this meeting in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2025. We co-hosted with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group. And we had 270 partners. Even we had very few federal participants this year, given some of the travel restrictions there. But still just this incredible network of collaborators from Canada, from Mexico, from across the United States come together. A meeting like this hadn't happened since 2012. And so we're excited to be able to co-host such a meeting. And in parallel with this gathering, we've also had the opportunity to work with support from the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, who has been instrumental in facilitating some of these tri-national conversations, facilitating a series of meetings and convening at this broader partner meeting to look back at that 2008 North American Monarch Conservation Plan and outline what does the next decade of monarch conservation look like. So we're actively working on that plan at the moment in collaboration with Canada and Mexico. So where can you go for more information? A lot of ways to get involved. So the one resource I'll point you to is our website, monarchjointventure.org. We have, a list of partners that we work with. So if you're looking for a specific partner in your area that might engage more closely, you might engage more closely with a whole number of online courses through our Nectar Hub, many different handouts on a variety of topics. I think, as Alyssa mentioned, 10 years of recorded webinars, FAQs. You could call our Pollinator Habitat Help Desk if you have a project in mind that you need help with. Our team is there to help you, either provide direct assistance for your project or to point you in the right direction of a local partner or collaborator that can help you there. That said, our broader dedicated program staff are there for your benefit. And so we offer them out to help with whatever monarch conservation activity you're most interested in. Maybe that's a volunteer program, a citizen science program. For monarchs, there are many. So our website does a great job of providing a whole plethora of information. So, boiling it all down, we need you and your network. I didn't add that as an afterthought. We certainly need all hands on deck. We need everybody on this call, but we also need those around you who might not be involved or as involved as they could be in monarch conservation. So we invite you here, to help us with our challenge, navigating a changing landscape. It's been a very difficult year, an interesting year to navigate. Not just the changing physical landscape, but the political landscape has changed the way that we think about conservation, sustainability. A lot of organizations, not just federal agencies, but those working closely with federal collaborators, are struggling right now with the government shutdown, with government resources being taken away. And so we're really looking at a time where we have to mobilize our mission in new ways and lead and persevere through these challenging times. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for what you're already doing. But if you're ready to do more, of course, take all the actions, planting habitat, engaging people, studying monarchs, collaborating, go out in your communities and be a champion, share our social media posts and be a voice for conservation. And last but not least, valuing the conservation organizations, the leaders who are working in this space to make a difference. With these funding challenges, the people behind the work that we do are the most important thing to continuing to make sure that that work happens. And so, we kindly ask your support in the most flexible of ways so that we can continue to not just continue our work, but expand our work. And then, of course, thank you to all our funders. I won't read everyone here. They're all on our website, but we wouldn't be here without generous and diverse support from a lot of different agencies and organizations and businesses and individual donors as well. So thank you to our funders. With that, I hope we had some great questions coming in. Court has come back here, so I will stop sharing and we'll move into questions.
Awesome. Well, Wendy, incredible, amazing presentation, wonderful ending notes there. You can't see it in the audience, but everybody's clapping wildly. A few standing ovations. That was really great. And I have to just say from personal experience, having worked with MJV and you for a number of years, I'm continually inspired by myself learning new programs and new things all the time from you. And inspiration is kind of the key thing, just to underline a main goal of this presentation is we hope this inspires you and indeed to take some form of action. It reminds me of a great quote, or maybe like a combination of quotes, that you cannot save what you do not love and you cannot love what you do not know. So help MJV get you to know the monarch more, know the conservation challenges and opportunities more. And we hope you do take that next step to further get involved. We have a lot of great questions here. We've been tracking them diligently, and we're going to have a Q&A session until the top of the hour. I will let you know that if we don't get to your question, we are going to send an email out to everyone on this call, everyone on this webinar, with a host of resources, things that Wendy shared in one of those final slides, in addition to answers to the questions that we do not have time to get to. So those will come to everyone via email, again, along with a lot of easy buttons to hit to get more involved, whether it's citizen science, whether it's advocacy, whether it's joining future webinars like this one. So resources coming your way. Okay, Q&A time. Wendy, I hope you're ready for them. I'm going to start with an easy one, but it's a very important one. Is what is the name of the app to track the monarchs with transmitters? What is the name?
Project Monarch. Available
Cool.
on Android and iOS.
Yes, it's very fun. It's very great. We've been waiting for such technology to emerge for literally decades, and it's here. And of course, we invite everyone to participate. Next one, I like this one quite a bit. The ingenuity, the creativity. Has anyone used a drone with a payload dropper to guerrilla plant milkweed in hard to reach areas?
Maybe not so much. Well, yeah, no, they have done milkweed. So we have worked with some one of our partners, and I'm sure others do this as well, in California, has done some planting with via drone. And I think also some innovative technology such that there's a specific design, rhyme and rhythm to the seed ball that they're dropping to enhance germination, etc. So yeah, some cool things happening there.
Very cool. All right. Okay, next one. Is non-native milkweed more harmful than beneficial to monarchs and monarch habitat?
Is non-native milkweed more
harmful than beneficial?
Yeah, that's, I didn't touch on the non-native tropical milkweed issue. Primarily, we're looking at that from the perspective of anywhere that tropical milkweed can grow year-round, it can be a problem. And so it's not necessarily a universal issue across the whole range. People will plant tropical milkweed in Minnesota, and while it's not native, it dies back like an annual. And so it's less problematic for monarchs in that sense. But in areas like along the Gulf Coast, where that tropical milkweed can persist year round, then that's where we start to see issues with monarchs coming through that are migrating, sometimes coming out of reproduction and reproducing, that tropical milkweed being more ridden because it's had time to build up the OE parasite spores. That's where we see more challenges with disruptions in terms of harmfulness to the population.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so next question or two, kind of a couple questions here along the same lines of home raising of monarch butterflies. First one, how do you feel about raising monarchs in enclosures for protection, whether in indoors or outdoors? So kind of touching on the overall home rearing of monarchs conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's always a good conversation to have. I raise a few monarchs in my home with my kids. It's an incredible learning opportunity, and so we certainly see the value there in raising monarchs from an education and inspiration value. That said, in terms of raising monarchs to protect them, certainly it does protect an individual butterfly. But I guess I take the position that when it comes to saving the population, us continuing to intervene and protect them from nature isn't going to be a long-term solution. So I'd rather focus that energy on creating habitat in nature and really giving them the tools that they need to survive and continuing to raise monarchs for education and inspiration.
All right, excellent. And then the sort of conjoined one to that one, also sort of having to do with home habitat and rearing, but with a million folks involved in habitat creation and home rearing of monarchs, why is it that no major conservationists are acknowledging all the work that we do? And I would argue that if you look for it, there's a lot of celebration out there, but I would be keen to hear your take on that question, Wendy.
Celebration of home rearing and its contribution to conservation efforts.
Well, I think what the question is asking is, with all the folks involved, the hundreds involved in this talk and the thousands at home planting, monarch way stations and whatnot. Perhaps what the question is getting at is why is there not more acknowledgement of that, maybe by the overall kind of general media? I think that's what it's getting at, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah, I think it's a complicated topic, right? So I mean, I spent many years in my undergraduate days in the lab raising monarchs, and boy, can I tell you stories of disease and issues. And monarchs are, if you don't run a super clean operation, monarchs aren't intended to be in large groups. In the wild, they're often by themselves. They get bacteria and viruses just like we do. Unfortunately, it's often fatal. So while I trust that many people who are raising monarchs do it well, I think there are many that also don't. And so we're looking at issues like while the monarch may appear healthy, you could be inadvertently spreading the OE parasite to all those monarchs in your enclosures if you're not following the right practices, or wipe out your whole population because some bacteria or virus comes in. And not to mention some of the disruptions to migration, and they're reading these environmental cues. So that said, I'm not opposed to rearing, but there are so many nuances that in terms of an effective conservation strategy, it's really not where we're at with, there are a lot of programs that are captive rearing and reintroduction, but they're really in controlled laboratory environments where we're down to the last straw of species conservation, and we're not there with monarchs. So really we're still at the stage where we need to put habitat in the ground to get them where they need to be to self-sustain.
excellent answer. Okay, switching gears here a little bit. This is another easy one. Will this webinar be an annual event?
Yeah. We do intend to do this annually.
Excellent, excellent. In general, what size of habitat is usually needed to attract monarchs in order to reproduce, i.e., 80 milkweed plants? What are we talking about here?
We don't have a minimum. I like to say that I've found monarch caterpillars on milkweeds in the crack in the sidewalk. So all it takes is a single milkweed plant to support a monarch. That said, certainly we encourage you to go bigger than that. I think our cutoffs or recommendations for, if you're participating in something like the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, where you're monitoring a patch of milkweed every week looking for eggs and caterpillars, I think our lower threshold recommendation there is 10 plants, 10 stems of milkweed.
There you have it, 10. Okay, here we go. Since the Western monarch population is smaller and more concentrated within California, both during breeding and overwintering, And it's more vulnerable overall. I'd love to support MJV's important work, specifically in the West. Is there a donation page or fund that specifically supports your Western monarch efforts? And I believe there is, but I'll let you
Yeah,
answer that.
yeah. And yep, just to clarify, so those Western monarchs do go beyond California, but there certainly California has a huge emphasis in terms of overwintering, and that first step of migration to more inland Western landscape. We do have a Western fund that supports, we have a Western monarchs, the Monarchs in More Western Habitat program, where we're supporting projects on the ground there. So we definitely have ways to support specific areas or initiatives. If you're interested in a specific area of our work, always feel free to reach out, and we can tell you, kind of show you what the opportunities are we have in that region.
Fantastic. And I see Alyssa just put a link to that in the chat if folks are interested in taking a look. Okay, what are considered the boundary states for the Eastern versus Western monarch population?
Well, the Rocky Mountains. It's really more the mountain range is the physical boundary between the populations. And there's some interchange between Eastern and Western monarchs, the extent to which isn't super well known, but we do know that there is some exchange. I think more so from the Southwest, where in Arizona, New Mexico, for example, some of those butterflies can go to California and some can go to Mexico. So there's definitely interchange, but the mountain range is the physical boundary.
Okay, excellent. This is quite an interesting one. Do we have any sense of current monarch populations compared to pre-European settlement in North America? Did monarch populations become artificially inflated when land was cleared and settled, or did populations begin their decline as soon as grasslands of the Corn Belt went under the plow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we don't have enough information to know for sure. Certainly, there are historic records indicating monarchs in times before we tracked them. I think the illusion that, or the point alluded to in the question, that could we have in some way through land use changes inadvertently inflated monarch populations? Absolutely. We talk about that, where milkweed loves disturbance. And so I think where land was tilled under, we probably saw explosions. Well, we know we saw explosions of milkweed prior to herbicide tolerant crop technology. Milkweed's abundant in row crop fields because when you cultivated those areas, milkweed came back in higher numbers than it started. And so certainly that is a possibility.
And I'll add a quick point on that is, scientists have established this sort of minimum viable population size in Mexico, and we are under that, unfortunately. So even if the numbers could have inflated, the idea of monarchs being able to continue the migration, return year after year, we're under that. So no matter what, it's still, we're still low. Okay, moving on here. Monarchs overwinter in Oyamel fir forest in Mexico. The trees are getting cut down and replaced by avocado farms. Can we stop the perpetrators, and who is doing all this? It's a loaded question. And I'm happy to
Yeah.
jump in if you need any Mexico
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, please feel free, Court, to elaborate. I will say with the avocado plantations, they're largely lower down the mountains than where the butterflies are. So while there might be some issues with water diversion, the avocado plantations themselves aren't in the butterfly in the reserve. So that's not to say it doesn't have its challenges, but it is an important nuance there with regard to avocados. I don't know, Court, what would you add?
It's exactly what I would have said, pretty much. The avocados are in and around 6,000 feet, maybe 7,000 feet, and the butterfly reserves really start at around 10,000. But there are issues, the water, like you said, like they're pulling water from mountain springs and whatnot. So it's something that is of everybody's paying attention to it, but it's not directly replacing trees.
Yeah. And I think it's
Um,
also an important factor, when we're thinking about conservation in Mexico, these are very rural economies, and, they're relying on tourism from the butterflies, but, also making a living. And so we have to factor in all of those social economic considerations into how we approach sustainability protections for monarchs, but also ensuring that the people have a way to make a living as well.
Exactly. And I'll just do a quick plug for this idea of ecotourism in the area. It is doable. You actually can go see the overwintering butterflies, and it's a pretty big economic boon to the local people. It's essentially adding value to the forest. These trees are now worth hundreds, if not thousands of times more alive than dead because of the butterfly ecotourism. And Monarch Joint Venture does a trip down there, a couple trips a year to see this amazing phenomenon. So we'll likely provide information about that in the follow-up too. Okay, next question. Oh, you know what? This is going to be our final question. I notice it is now we're at time. We do have other questions, folks. We will get those answered in the follow-up email to the best of our ability. But the last one, I'm confused as to the difference between threatened and endangered under the US proposals. This doesn't sound like much protection. Can you please explain more?
Yeah, well, threatened versus endangered has to do with their species status assessment of, how likely are they to reach some extinction level threshold in the foreseeable future. And so it's just a different designation. Threatened affords a lot more flexibility for conservation. Without getting super into it, I will say that with a species like the monarch, it is unprecedented, the scale and the level of the diversity of habitats, the number of considerations, where monarchs are everywhere. And so I think that with regard to protections under the Endangered Species Act, the proposed rule went with greater flexibility, recognizing that it's so complicated that too much regulation could actually prevent or backtrack us with regard to people getting involved in conservation efforts. So it's this balance of too much regulation could put us backwards, and we want to be inviting and make sure we're continuing to incentivize conservation actions moving forward.
Fantastic, Wendy. Well, thank you, and thank everyone for the fantastic questions, the participation today, the interest in the monarch butterfly. I want to tune you into our next webinar. We do a monthly webinar series on the third Tuesday of each month at 1 p.m. Central Time. Our next webinar this month is Native Garden Design and Climate Resilient Landscaping. That's going to be on October 28th at 1 p.m. Central with Sarah Resing from Wild Ones. And within this follow-up email, I keep on promising there's going to be a link to sign up for those webinars as well. So you can keep the education, information, and inspiration coming. Once again, thank you, everyone, especially Wendy, but also those in the audience. And thanks for all that you and MJV do for Monarchs.
Thank you all for tuning in.